Hi YouTube, it's the Fez Vlogger, and before we vlog tonight's book, I just wanted to talk about the fact that I've been talking about my vlog with some friends, and they all had some things they wanted to say about the book too. First of all, they wanted to say that although there are some really nice guys in this book, they don't exist, so we should not compare the guys that do exist to those who are just paper and ink. Also, I'm talking about Edward Cullen, not just Mr. Darcy. I know you're asking me why I'm wearing a silly hat on my head, and I want to tell you that this is because everything is done better when wearing a silly hat on your head. So the other day I was thinking about school and work and people, and I realized that life is not all fun and games, as much as we all might want it to be. What I did realize, though, was that life in general is kind of like books. Of course, some books aren't all that realistic, and sometimes it looks like some books were written for no other reason than to bring enjoyment to the reader, but what we can all agree on is that most characters in most books tend to act like normal people. For example, you're not going to show up on someone's doorstep with a revolver in your hand, shoot them in the back, and then feel good about it, because the human conscience just doesn't work like that. Unless you just so happen to be this man. But since we aren't all the Joker, and since we don't all live in Gotham, we can all relate to the attitudes and mannerisms of people in books who may have gone through some of the same things we have. This is called empathy, and this is one of the reasons we have favorite characters in the first place. And just like certain people are better at conveying the points of their conversations than others, certain books are better at conveying the characteristics of people than others. And this fact brings me to Pride and Prejudice. Now, there are a lot of characters in this book. In fact, there's a grand total of 20 people relative to the plot. But what they all seem to tell us is that people are like cakes, or sedimentary rocks, or onions if you're a DreamWorks fan, but what I'm getting at is that people have layers. Pride and Prejudice also touches on the fact that us human beings as a species rely way too much on the first impressions presented to us. In fact, you could kind of argue that that's almost exactly what Jane Austen wanted us to take from the book, considering that her original title for it was First Impressions. Jane Austen didn't get to use that title because she procrastinated and it was already taken by the time she finally decided to publish her book. But enough of the author's intent. There's other symbolism in this book, whether or not she intended for that to be the focus, and we are going to talk about it. Back to the onions. So people have layers, but since this book is essentially told from the point of view of Elizabeth Bennet, and since she's a human and therefore way too reliant on first impressions, when she meets Mr. Darcy and he unintentionally insults her, we kinda sorta figure that he's a jerkwad. But if we aren't too biased a reader, we realize that not only is Mr. Darcy not exactly a jerkwad, but Elizabeth isn't exactly a non-jerkwad either. In fact, she sorta promises herself that she'll always hate Mr. Darcy no matter what happens. But the point is that by the end of the book, we realize that not only is Mr. Darcy not a jerkwad, he's actually kind of a nice guy. Sure, he's awkward, and he doesn't really know how to talk to people, but he looks out for his friends, and in the end, he swallows his pride and tries to help Elizabeth by dealing with a man he really doesn't like just to change her ill-conceived view of him. It's because of this that you can argue that Elizabeth spends the entire book learning that people are cakes like Darcy, or onions like his nemesis Wickham, or stubborn and immovable rocks like herself. Miss Bennet asks herself why she's been blind to this realization all her life, but she doesn't see that this is because she's a giant chunk of human-shaped sandstone, and sandstone does not have eyes. And I suppose you could argue that, especially given the original title of the book, Elizabeth spends the entire novel learning that a first impression is no solid basis for judging something as complex and onion-like as a human being. I mean, seriously, she meets the soldier Wickham, and at first it seems like he's totally charming and a really nice guy, but by the end of the novel, we realize that he's actually a habitual bad gambler who tries to marry women that are just way too young to get married in order to get to their family's money. I'm not going to get into it too deeply at the moment, but one should note that it's pretty ironic and also maybe a little bit sad that this is true, especially considering the fact that Elizabeth tells us she prides herself on her ability to judge other people. Elizabeth Bennet, you done goofed! Of course, this doesn't mean that our main character is totally blind to the intents and true phases of others. She's just selectively blind. What I'm saying is, though she may think that Darcy is a horrible person when he isn't, and she may think that Wickham is a wonderful person when he isn't, she doesn't get every single human totally wrong. And when she does come around to finally seeing the things she didn't see before, she doesn't exactly fight the truth. In fact, she seems to handle it with some pretty high-caliber grace, and as we're reading the final chapters of the novel, we realize that if we were to conduct ourselves in a similar manner and learn from Elizabeth's mistakes, we could dramatically decrease world suck by learning to be more accepting of the people who rub us the wrong way at first, and more tolerant of the people who continue to ruffle our feathers long afterward. And then, like some sort of literary eagle from the skies above, a life lesson swoops down on us. I bet you didn't see that one coming.